Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive.
Definitely.
Awesome. Today, we're going deep into the world of corporate crime.
Sounds a bit intense.
Yeah, it can be. We've got a ton of research and notes to work through, and I'm curious to see what we uncover about the scale, the tactics, and the real-world impact of these crimes.
Yeah, it's a fascinating but kind of disturbing topic for sure. Where should we start?
Well, first off, I'm just curious, how widespread is this? Like, how often are we talking about here? How much corporate crime is actually going on?
Honestly, it's hard to say for sure because accurate statistics are, well, hard to come by.
I bet. Makes sense.
But what we do know from the research suggests it's way more common than people think, happening across tons of different industries. What I found pretty interesting is that environmental offenses are actually the top crimes committed by the biggest corporate criminals.
Really? That's not what I would guess.
Yeah, it surprised me too.
Interesting.
And of course, fraud is a huge concern.
Huh.
We've got these high-profile cases like Enron and WorldCom showing just how far companies will go to manipulate their finances.
Enron especially was wild. Creating all those fake entities to hide their debt. It's unbelievable how they kept up that facade for so long.
Right. It's crazy how much they got away with, and it makes you wonder, is this kind of deception still happening today, especially with all these new industries popping up like cryptocurrency?
Yeah, great point. Like, what about the FTX collapse? That seemed like a pretty massive case of fraud.
Definitely. The whole Sam Bankman-Fried situation is a perfect example of how these schemes can play out, even in these newer, more tech-driven fields. And FTX isn't alone. We've seen similar issues with companies like Theranos and Ubiome promising the world and then, well, failing to deliver.
Right, those were big stories too. Okay, so we've got companies destroying the environment and we've got elaborate financial schemes. What other kinds of activities fall under this corporate crime umbrella?
Oh, there's a whole range. You've got antitrust violations where companies try to crush their competition or rig prices.
Right, right.
Then there are financial crimes like embezzlement, insider trading, money laundering, basically.
Yeah.
Using your position in a company to make a quick buck illegally. And we can't forget bribery and corruption. That can be anything from small favors to huge schemes involving government officials.
So a really wide range of offenses. And the consequences, I imagine, go way beyond just lost money, right?
Oh, absolutely. The impact is massive, hitting individuals, communities, and even the entire economy.
Makes sense.
We're talking financial losses for sure, but also environmental damage, sometimes even loss of life, and just this overall erosion of trust in, well, in everything.
One source mentioned that healthcare fraud alone costs the U.S. somewhere between $100 to $400 billion every year. That's insane. And it makes you think, how much of that are we paying for indirectly?
Yeah, it's a staggering amount, and that's just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
When you add up all the different types of corporate crime, the total cost is astronomical. And as you said, it's not just about the dollars and cents, it's about the real human cost. Like the BP oil spill was a harsh reminder that corporate negligence can have tragic consequences.
Oh, absolutely. The environmental damage, the lives lost, the impact on people's livelihoods. It's hard to even grasp the full extent of it.
It's truly devastating. And even when lives aren't directly lost, people still suffer. They lose jobs, savings, even their homes. Entire communities are left to deal with the fallout of these disasters or economic downturns.
It's heartbreaking, but it raises a really important question. If these crimes are so widespread, so damaging, how are corporations getting away with it? What allows them to avoid any real punishment?
Well, it seems like there are a few mechanisms at play. One of the most common is something called a deferred prosecution agreement, or DPA.
A DPA.
Yeah, basically it's an agreement between the corporation and the government. The company admits they did something wrong, agrees to pay a fine, and promises to implement certain reforms, but in exchange, they get to avoid a trial and potentially a criminal conviction.
So it's like a plea bargain, but for corporations.
Exactly. DPAs can be a useful tool for resolving these cases, but some people argue they're too lenient and don't really deter future wrongdoing.
Yeah, I can see that. If a company can just pay a fine and move on, what's to stop them from doing the same thing again?
That's the big question. Critics of DPAs say it lets corporations basically buy their way out of trouble, and that the fines are often just a small price to pay compared to the profits they made from their illegal activities.
So it's almost like the system is designed to protect them rather than hold them accountable.
It can feel that way sometimes. And it's not just DPAs. We're also seeing a decrease in the number of federal prosecutions for white-collar crimes.
Seriously.
Yeah, it's like it's becoming harder to prosecute corporate crime, or maybe there's just less interest in going after these powerful companies.
That's a worrying trend for sure. Are there other ways these corporations are dodging accountability?
Definitely. A lot of cases are settled through negotiated settlements. It's all done behind closed doors, away from the public eye.
So no messy trial, no dirty laundry aired out for everyone to see.
Exactly. And the punishments are often much lighter.
It all feels very hush-hush, like they're trying to sweep these crimes under the rug.
You're not wrong. And then there are leniency programs designed to encourage companies to self-report violations and cooperate with law enforcement.
Okay.
But some argue that these programs actually let corporations off the hook too easily.
So basically, it seems like there are quite a few ways for corporations to avoid taking full responsibility for their actions.
Unfortunately, yes. And there's another troubling aspect. We tend to focus on holding the corporation liable rather than the individuals responsible.
What do you mean by that?
Well, often prosecutors go after the corporation as a whole instead of targeting the specific executives who actually made the decisions that led to the crime.
So the people at the top, the ones calling the shots, they get off scot-free.
Often, yes. And that sends a really dangerous message. It's like saying, hey, you can engage in risky, even illegal behavior, and you won't face any personal consequences.
They're gambling with other people's lives, and their own necks are protected.
It's a very uneven playing field. And even when corporations are fined, the fines are often so tiny compared to their profits that they're just seen as the cost of doing business.
It's like they're paying for a license to break the law.
It can feel that way. And lastly, there's often just a lack of awareness. Many corporate offenders simply don't grasp how severe the punishments could be. They don't see other companies getting penalized, so they don't take the law seriously.
It's like a system that's rigged against the average person protecting the powerful.
Yeah, and that leads to another key point about the injustice of all this. Corporate crime doesn't just cause harm, it actively makes existing inequalities even worse.
That's a scary thought. How so?
Well, think about how resources are allocated. When a corporation commits a white-collar crime, they're basically taking resources away from essential public services, things like education, healthcare, and social programs. And those are the services that vulnerable communities rely on most.
So they're not only committing these crimes, they're making life even tougher for those already struggling.
Exactly. And then there's the uneven distribution of consequences. When a corporation commits a crime, who really suffers the most? The employees lose their jobs, investors lose their savings, consumers are exposed to unsafe products. These are often people already dealing with financial hardship.
It's a double whammy.
Right. And we can't forget about the widening wealth gap. Corporate crimes contribute to this by making the rich richer, while siphoning wealth away from the middle and lower classes. It's a vicious cycle.
And the erosion of trust we talked about, does that factor in too?
Absolutely. When people lose faith in institutions and the fairness of the system, it can lead to unrest, instability, and more division within society. And in times of turmoil, who suffers the most? The vulnerable communities, the marginalized groups, already at a disadvantage.
Wow, so it's not just a financial or legal problem, it's a social justice issue.
Exactly. It's an issue that needs way more attention than it's getting.
For sure. We've covered a lot of ground, but it feels like we've barely scratched the surface. To really understand this, I think we need to delve into some concrete examples,
Yeah.
ready to go deeper.
Absolutely. Let's get into it. Hashtag TTS, the Deep Dive episode 2024-1211, part 2 of 3. Let's go back to Enron for a second. It's like the textbook example of corporate fraud, the one that really shook things up.
Yeah, I remember when that whole thing blew up. It was huge.
They were this giant energy company, but behind the scenes, they were using all these accounting tricks, hiding billions of dollars in debt. They built this image of success while the company was basically rotting from the inside.
It felt like such a betrayal, like the whole system was rigged against ordinary people.
It definitely showed some big problems with how we regulate companies in the financial world. And when the truth finally came out, the damage was insane.
Investors lost a fortune.
Billions, yeah. Thousands of employees lost their jobs, their retirement savings, everything. And the company, well, it imploded, even took down Arthur Andersen, one of the biggest accounting firms at the time, with it.
It's crazy how one company's actions can have such a ripple effect.
It's wild, right? The impact can be massive. And Enron wasn't a one-off thing. WorldCom is another example of corporate greed gone wrong.
Oh yeah, what happened there?
WorldCom was a telecom company, and get this, they inflated their assets by like $11 billion. They basically made up entries in their accounting books to make the company seem way more profitable than it actually was.
So basically, cooking the books, like Enron, To trick investors.
Exactly. And just like Enron, it all came crashing down. Bankruptcy, job losses, criminal charges for the executives.
It's mind-blowing how they can operate on such a huge scale, deceiving so many people for so long.
It really makes you wonder who's protecting the average investor, right?
But let's switch gears a bit and talk about environmental crime. A classic example is the BP oil spill.
Oh man, that was just awful. For the environment and for all the people whose livelihoods depended on the Gulf.
The Deepwater Horizon explosion back in 2010, it was one of the worst environmental disasters ever. Millions of barrels of oil spilled into the Gulf, just wreaking havoc on marine life, the coastline, everything.
Those images of oil-soaked birds and sea turtles, it was heartbreaking. And the fishing industry, tourism, just devastated.
Absolutely. And when they investigated, it turned out that BP had basically chosen saving money over safety, ignoring warnings, not taking proper precautions.
So their negligence caused this whole catastrophe.
Pretty much, yeah. And while they did end up paying billions in fines and settlements, the damage was already done. It's a harsh lesson that corporate negligence can have massive, long-lasting consequences. It's also a reminder that these crimes aren't just about numbers on a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
There's a real human cost, an environmental cost.
For sure. And it's not just oil spills. We see companies illegally dumping toxic waste, polluting our water, our air, even contributing to climate change by breaking environmental laws. And these actions often hit vulnerable communities the hardest, the ones who don't have the resources to fight back or recover.
It's a reminder that social justice and environmental justice are totally connected.
Absolutely. Now let's jump to something more recent, the whole FTX collapse. Another massive fraud case, but this time in the world of cryptocurrency.
This one felt different, maybe because it was this new kind of mysterious world of digital money.
Yeah, the FTX case really shows how corporate crime can adapt and thrive in these new emerging industries. Sam Bankman-Fried, the founder, was accused of running this multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme, misusing customer funds, lying to investors about how well his company was doing.
Yeah, it's crazy how fast his whole empire fell apart. Shows how fragile trust is, especially in the digital world.
And how easily people can take advantage of that trust. But it's not just crypto. We've seen similar things in the tech sector. Companies like Theranos, Nubiome, starting out with all this promise and innovation, and then, boom, exposed for fraud.
Theranos especially, that was a wild ride.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Holmes, the founder, was supposed to be this visionary.
Yeah, they claimed to have this revolutionary blood testing technology. Turned out it was all smoke and mirrors. Investors lost a ton of money, and it really highlighted the dangers of hype and unchecked ambition in Silicon Valley.
It seems like these crimes are always evolving, popping up in whatever new industry is taking off.
Exactly. And as these new sectors grow, it becomes even more important to focus on accountability and transparency. We have to be proactive in stopping these crimes before they take root.
But as we've seen, it seems like there are so many ways for corporations to avoid being held responsible.
Yeah.
You mentioned deferred prosecution agreements, those DPAs, earlier. Can you break down how those work in practice?
Sure. A DPA is basically a deal between a company and the government. The company admits they messed up, agrees to pay a fine, and make some changes to how they do things. In exchange, the government agrees not to take them to court or press charges.
So it's a way for them to avoid a trial and all the bad press that comes with it.
Exactly. It can be a faster, cheaper way to resolve things than a long, drawn-out trial. But some people criticize DPAs for being too lenient, saying they don't really stop companies from doing the same bad things again.
I can see that. If a company can just pay a fine and go back to business as usual, what's the incentive to change?
That's the big concern. Critics say DPAs basically let corporations buy their way out of trouble, and that the fines are often peanuts compared to the money they made through their illegal activities.
Doesn't sound like a very strong deterrent. Are there any efforts to fix this?
There are definitely people pushing for reform. Some experts say we need more transparency around DPAs, make companies share more details about the agreement so the public can hold them accountable. Others say the fines need to be much bigger to actually make a difference.
It seems like there's a real need for change.
Absolutely. And it's not just about DPAs. We're also seeing fewer federal prosecutions for white-collar crimes overall.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it's a worrying trend. It suggests that corporate criminals are getting away with more and more.
What's behind this decline in prosecutions?
It's complicated, a lot of factors involved. Some experts point to shifting priorities within the Department of Justice. Maybe they're focusing on other types of crime.
Okay.
Others say it's because of budget cuts. They just don't have the resources to investigate and prosecute these complex financial crimes. And then there's the issue of political will. Some argue that there's simply not enough interest in going after powerful corporations and wealthy individuals.
So a bunch of reasons, but the end result is fewer corporate criminals facing consequences.
Exactly. And that sends a terrible message. It basically says that if you have money and power, the rules don't apply to you.
It's like one set of rules for the elite and another for everyone else. What about those negotiated settlements we talked about? Are those contributing to this problem too?
They definitely raise some concerns about transparency and accountability. Remember, those are settlements that happen outside of court, often kept very secret. That lack of transparency makes it hard to know if corporations are truly being held responsible, if justice is being served.
They get to avoid the public eye, the scrutiny of a trial.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder if the punishments really fit the crime. If a company can just pay a fine and avoid going to court, is that enough to deter them from doing it again?
It feels like they're getting off easy.
And a lot of these settlements include confidentiality agreements, meaning the people involved can't talk about what happened.
So they can't share any details?
Nope. That makes it hard to learn from these cases to prevent the same thing from happening again.
It's like they're burying the truth.
Right, and that kind of secrecy erodes public trust in the justice system. It feeds the perception that corporations are above the law, that the system is rigged to protect them.
So how do we fix this? How do we make sure corporate criminals are actually held accountable?
That's the million-dollar question. There's no easy answer, but there are some things we could do. One idea is to make these negotiated settlements more transparent. Force companies to share more details about the agreement so the public can see what's going on.
That makes sense. More sunlight on the process.
All right. Another important change would be to make the penalties for corporate crime much tougher. Right now, the fines are often so small that companies just see them as the cost of doing business. We need to make it hurt financially to deter them from breaking the law.
Hit them where it hurts, their wallets. But fines alone might not be enough.
You're right. We also need to shift the focus from blaming the company as a whole to holding the individuals responsible. If we go after the executives personally, it sends a much stronger message.
It makes them think twice before they do something shady.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, we need to create a culture of compliance within corporations. Make sure ethical behavior is encouraged and rewarded, provide training on the laws, and make it safe for employees to report wrongdoing without fear of getting in trouble.
So build a system where doing the right thing is valued and where bad behavior is caught and dealt with quickly.
Exactly. It's a big challenge, but I think it's crucial if we want a system that values fairness and justice. Hashtag TTS The Deep Dive episode 2024-1211, part 3 of 3.
We were talking about those negotiated settlements, how they let corporations avoid the spotlight. Seems like they often manage to skip a trial altogether.
Yeah, it all happens behind the scenes without much public attention. The company might agree to pay a fine, admit to some wrongdoing, maybe promise to change some things, and in return, the government basically drops the case.
So they get to quietly resolve things, no messy trial, no bad press.
Exactly. And while that can be quicker and cheaper than a long court battle, it does raise concerns about transparency and accountability.
Because without a trial, there's no public record of the evidence, no chance for victims to speak out, and it's hard to tell if justice is really being served.
Right. It also might not be as effective in preventing future wrongdoing. If companies see their competitors getting off with a slap on the wrist, they might be more likely to take risks themselves.
It's like a get-out-of-jail-free card for the rich and powerful.
It can feel that way, and those confidentiality agreements we talked about, they're often part of these settlements, so no one involved can talk about the details.
So we can't learn from these cases, maybe prevent similar things from happening?
Exactly. It makes it harder to hold corporations accountable, and it erodes public trust in the system. People start to think, well, if they can get away with it, why should I follow the rules?
So more transparency is key.
Definitely. Some experts argue that companies should be required to share more information about these settlements so the public can see what's going on.
More sunlight, less secrecy. Makes sense. What else can we do to hold these corporations accountable?
Well, we've talked about stronger penalties, and I think that's a big one. The fines often aren't big enough to really deter bad behavior.
So make it hurt financially, right?
Right. But it can't just be about money. We also need to shift the focus from blaming the corporation as a whole to going after the individuals who are actually responsible.
Hold those executives personally accountable.
Exactly. Make it clear that if you break the law, you face consequences, not just the company.
That would definitely make people think twice.
And finally, we need to create a culture where ethical behavior is the norm, not the exception. Promote good practices, train employees on the laws, make it safe for people to report wrongdoing without fear of retaliation.
Build a system where doing the right thing is rewarded and doing the wrong thing has serious consequences.
Exactly. It's a multi-pronged approach, but it's essential if we want a system that truly values justice and fairness.
Well, this deep dive has been eye-opening. We've learned about the shocking prevalence of corporate crime, the devastating impact it has, and the ways these crimes are allowed to flourish.
It's a sobering reality, but knowledge is power. Understanding the problem is the first step towards fixing it.
I totally agree. We've also talked about some possible solutions, like increasing transparency, tougher penalties, holding individuals responsible, and creating a culture of compliance. These are all crucial steps in the right direction.
And we all have a role to play in demanding change. Stay informed, speak out against corporate wrongdoing, support organizations fighting for accountability. We can make a difference.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this exploration of corporate crime. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about these complex issues, the better equipped we are to push for change. Until next time, stay curious.